So again, welcome to our Net Promoter Score and Overall Experience Rating Deep Dive COVES webinar. I'm going to get started actually with a few poll questions that we put together just to see what people are thinking about NPS and OER. So put the first one up. I'll give you all, I don't know, 20 seconds to answer, and then I'll share results. We've got 2 questions after this. Love it. Almost full group participation. I'm going to stop this one. So as you can see, it looks like almost half of you are equally comfortable with both. But I'm focused on those bottom 2 bars, not comfortable with either or haven't started using the metric. That's not uncommon. And even if you think you're very comfortable, there's always a new consideration when it comes to something like Net Promoter Score or overall experience rating. So refreshers are always good. As a hilarious happenstance, as we were preparing for this call, we realized that we, through the COVES community, gave an NPS and OER webinar in February of 2020. So exactly 3 years ago, I mean, not to the day, where we covered this stuff. But so much of our community and our work has changed, and so many of our participants have changed, that it was really timely. So wherever you fall on this, no worries. There are some other questions we'd like to ask. So regardless of comfort, do you have a preference? And if only this were the COVES survey, right? You could say the limitation of this question is, I don't understand why you're reporting the way you are. All right, responses have stopped coming in. I love it. It does depend, or it should depend. And I bet your preference has a caveat there on it probably depends too. Maybe it's attached to your familiarity with the rating, but maybe it depends on this next question, which is, which metric does your leadership ask for most often? Wonderful. So unsurprising to me, NPS tends to be the metric that most leadership asks for most often. And that's a really important consideration when we go through all the ins and outs of both NPS and OER. I love to see that some leadership asks equally. And I love that some leadership in this among these institutions don't request either, because I bet you can change that over time, right? With repeated reporting or kind of sharing things incrementally and highlighting how you're using COVES data to think about not just NPS and OER, but your audiences in general, could be really important to kind of turning the tide there on getting leadership to ask for some of these data. So thank you all for giving a little bit of information. I'm going to start screen sharing again. There's a lot of content here. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I probably won't address them immediately because, again, we're going to reserve some time for Q&A at the end, but definitely flag sections where I've caused confusion or anything you want to go back to over time. And I hope I'm able to do this effectively. Yes, you see the full screen slides? Cool. Okay, so here we go. Let's start things off by just showing a fun, if not slightly blurry, rendition of our detractors, passives, and promoters make the best survey game that a colleague of ours drew. Hilariously, this was done well before COVID, probably early in our COVES IMLS grant. What I love about this, one, is that the comment says, please your stakeholder, which is absolutely true. And 2, the categories for passives, promoters, and detractors are not accurate based on our scale, which is, again, not surprising, something we're going to come back to. All right. So I'm going to start by digging into the Net Promoter Score. Then I'm going to go into overall experience rating. And I try and do these in a systematic way. So I'm presenting information about both. And then we're going to talk about some of the ins and outs. We're going to end with some data examples before going into Q&A. So the Net Promoter Score is trademarked. It comes from this, well, this is one example of a book that was written about it in the industry that's kind of spawned. But the question is, on a scale from 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend fill in the blank to a friend or colleague? And you can see the scale there. This is really important because this is the brand standard. I put on a scale from 0 to 10 in brackets because we, COVES, doesn't include that. And I wanted to highlight this important distinction because Rob Markey, whose name is on the book that you see, actually consulted with the Museum of Science during COVES in our early stages and helped us make some iterative changes. The obvious one is if the scale of 0 to 10 is right there when you're asking the question, you're just adding burden by saying something they can already see that you don't need to explain because we're not adding any new information about what 0 to 10 means. But that's the question. Prior to that book, The Ultimate Question 2.0, it was actually introduced much earlier than that publication in roughly 2011 in the partnership between Harvard Business School, Harvard Business Review, and Bain and Satmetrics. It is primarily a measure of customer or brand loyalty, as you can see in that question. How likely are you to recommend us? When we talk about Net Promoter Score, we often talk about word of mouth advertising, right? What people are likely to do that we don't have to pay for because it represents some kind of connection between a place, a business, and the people who go to that place or the people who purchase from that business. The quote here comes directly from Reicheld's initial article about what loyalty means. And you can see it's an investment or personal sacrifice in order to strengthen a relationship. It all comes down to relationships. That's the whole premise of the Net Promoter Score. The 0 to 10 scale is meaningful in that it can be segmented into 3 groups: detractors from 0 to 6, passives from 7 to 8, and promoters from 9 to 10. The Net Promoter Score, right, the net score, is actually the subtraction of the percentage of detractors from the percentage of promoters. As a net score, it has a possible range of -100 if everybody is a detractor to +100 where everyone is a promoter. So in that sense, even though you can kind of think about percentages or the way we display frequencies are often in that percentage mindset, the net score itself is not a percentage. It's a decimal that can range from -100.0 to +100.0. And importantly, in this calculation, passives, anybody who scores a 7 or 8, are omitted from the calculation. So NPS, if you read, and I should preface this by saying there is a lot of literature on Net Promoter Score, probably because it's been around for the better part of 20 years. So journal articles, blog posts, literal books, as I have right here. You can find a lot of stuff to read about it. In the promotional materials, i.e. the blog posts and the books that came from Harvard Business Review, the claims are that you can predict loyalty and use differences in Net Promoter Score to explain differences in revenue, right? So this is, I mean, by and large, financially driven. If you want your business to do well and you understand the relationship or the loyalty of your customers, you can predict your growth. Furthermore, by asking for open-ended feedback, why did you give us this score, you can close the loop, i.e. you can have a touch point with every single one of your visitors or your customers who participate in this Net Promoter Score survey. And even though we, through the COVES community, find this to be commonplace, that we're reaching our visitors or our customer facing, so much of the measurement that was done 20 years ago was operational in nature. And I would argue even among the museum field, there's a lot more operational metrics than there are customer metrics. So this idea is was new at the time. Now again, through the abundance of literature since it was developed, unsurprisingly, many critiques have come out. Among those, and probably first and foremost, is that unpacking the why to any kind of rating takes considerable time. Finding patterns, identifying threads, thematic coding, whatever it is, and therefore identifying detractors in real time, meaning people who don't complete a survey and give you that feedback but like you're trying to avoid pitfalls, is very challenging. There's been a lot of statistical studies that have tried to demonstrate predictive validity is tenuous at best, meaning you can't actually predict customers' behavior from this metric in any affiliated measures you have. The concept of the aggregated score, right? That net score is kind of lacking if you rely more on the qualitative follow-up than you do on the numerical score itself. And there are too many citations to mention that question the use of the 0 to 10 scale versus a 0 to 7 or 0 to 5 scale versus Likert options, which we can discuss in a little bit more detail. There are more critiques than this as well, but these are just some of the highlights. So, right, everyone's got a favorite. Switching gears into overall experience rating. This question doesn't actually have a book or image. I thought about just showing a picture of the journal article that kind of promoted it initially, but I thought that was kind of boring. So here you have the question. Please rate your overall experience with this thing today, maybe. The scale itself, poor, fair, good, excellent, outstanding, is important, and we're going to talk a little bit about the scale itself and then the word choice. So first, the scale itself. The value of having this scale is that there is a scale point above excellent. So primarily in the museum field, when so many things are truly excellent, people have a choice to come here. They choose to come back. We have membership programs, etc. We find that we don't have a normal distribution where people cluster in the middle. Rather, we have a skewed distribution where people tend to cluster towards the top. And as a result, a normal 5-point scale, maybe poor, fair, good, really good, excellent, would have more discerning capabilities at the low end than at the high end, meaning people who rate us low versus people who rate us high. So by adding a scale point above excellent, we can stretch the variance and we can see more distinction between those upper level categories. So that's the value of having the OER scale. The literature that cites this primarily uses the upper scale point superior. During the break, when museums were closed in 2020, we made the decision to switch from the word superior to outstanding, primarily in light of a lot of the racial justice and social justice things that were coming up at the time, and the affiliation and connotation of the word superior with things that we did not want to bring up. And as we'll dive into a little bit in the defense of the OER scale, we can see that outstanding is a very good word replacement. The scale itself was developed early in the 2000s at the Smithsonian Institution. Andrew Peckerick was first and foremost the publishing author for a lot of the work and lead researcher, to my knowledge, at the Smithsonian doing this work. It was primarily an internal mechanism. They do share a lot of reports on their website, which can reference this over time. And I've already mentioned a little bit about the development and why that upper anchor was really important. It's been introduced more broadly in the last 5-ish years and has taken kind of more of a museum spin because it was developed at museums. And again, the seminal article there that's linked through wiley.com, we also have a PDF of it, and I feel comfortable sharing that because it has been spread through ResearchGate and other mechanisms for people to access. The quote here from Andrew Peckerick kind of defends this idea that there needs to be a place above excellent for visitors or customers to identify themselves when we ask how their experience was. And so when we think about the scale itself, there's a lot of different ways we could break it down. Not unlike the Net Promoter Score scale, where we're breaking things down from 0 to 10, 11 rating opportunities into 3 categories. This is just 5 categories, but the way that people conceptualize this, and I'm speaking directly from a YouTube video, which I think is affiliated with the Smithsonian development of this, but it talks about the lowest 3 categories, poor, fair, and good, identifying room for improvement. If you're finding visitors or customers who are scoring less than excellent, those are opportunities where you can improve. In terms of satisficing or meeting expectations, excellent tends to be the thing that people came to see or do. And if you're outstanding or superior, as were the case previously, you're exceeding expectations. You're delivering something that is so top-notch that there needs to be a place for people to tell you, actually, I'm above excellent. This was better than possibly what I was expecting, what I was told, or maybe just I had a wonderful time. So similar to the Net Promoter Score, there are some claims in defense of its development and in defense of its use, primarily that it responds to 4 dimensions of quality of experience: subjective, user-centric, holistic, multidimensional. Now, I would argue at least some of those apply to Net Promoter Score, but certainly not all of them. There was a purposeful use of a non-numerical scale that has an upper limit beyond excellent, as we've just discussed. And unlike the Net Promoter Score, which, again, if you think about how that single response item can be used at the individual or survey respondent level, OER is supposed to be used in subsequent predictive analytics. So how can we create that excellent or above experience to kind of transcend the visitor experience on behalf of our institutions? Now, I put this slide in just to be fair, right? Because we want to have some kind of parallel approach to looking at both of these. Truthfully, I haven't discovered many articles critiquing overall experience rating. That's partially because it is limited to the museum field, or at least was generated by the museum field, and so it hasn't been adopted by multiple industries outside of our own. And also because it's much newer, at least in its broad implementation, compared to something like that Promoter Score. But you can see here my critique is that one of those claims it has is that about individual analytics versus group analytics. Yes, it is very difficult to isolate a single Net Promoter Score response for future analytics, but it's not impossible because of the categorization from detractor, passive, and promoter, and for things like logistic regression when you're trying to put people into buckets. So I think that's possible. I've done it. I don't advocate for it, certainly, but pros and cons to everything. So I'm going to talk for a second now about the change of wording from superior to outstanding. The first is a YouGov poll that was done basically asking about the goodness of words. How good is good? Or what words mean good to you on a scale from 0, very negative, to 10, very positive. Hilariously, the Net Promoter Score scale question, right? And you can see here what I've done is I've shown the full response set and then the top scoring words. And outstanding was the second highest rated word as far as its goodness or positive connotation. I'll problematize this just a little bit by showing the same survey from YouGov, which actually broke down survey responses between British and American English-speaking surveyed individuals. And it shows that outstanding actually was outperformed by several other words, including excellent, within the American cohort. So possible differences in word choice or how good a thing is, but I'll further caveat this by saying that the initial authors of that 2018 article in Curator magazine actually tested rigorously many different words on their scale to think about what meant above excellent, right? What was going to be that word? And one of the word choices was outstanding. The reason we chose outstanding in favor of anything else was that it had been tested and it had been shown to be reliable in subsequent studies of the OER scale in pushing the distribution beyond excellent within the same set of institutions and experiences. So we've got a lot of statistical argument for why this was a good change. And yet, we didn't really test it ourselves. We had the strong support of the COVES community and the questions and measures team at the time. There were a lot of social circumstances that pushed us to make the change. In fact, it was only at the recommendation of people not directly affiliated with the core instrument that we made the change. It was suggested to us that we should consider it, and it was a great suggestion. These are COVES data, as you can see, although the font might be small, from the calendar year 2019, pre-pandemic, and the calendar year 2021. I'm calling it post-pandemic, right? There's a gap year of 2020 where everything was weird. I know that everything was kind of continues to be weird, and even in 2021, things were certainly not normal. What I want to highlight in this graph is the distributional change between the top word from superior to outstanding in those top two graphs where we have pre and post data, in the minimal change in the combination between excellent and that word, right? Excellent plus superior at first, 84%, excellent plus outstanding, 88%. Those are close. This is a huge sample. You can see 19,000, 5,000, close to 6,000 responses. So those are statistically different. 4% is meaningful. But the biggest jump, of course, is in that top category. So we raised the question, is the experience different or is the scale different? And does that matter? So I'm saying I don't know, but it is interesting to note that we see this difference in the data based on a word choice and or different experiences because the world had changed during that time. I have some additional considerations. I'm going to harp on NPS, not because I don't like it, but because when we started the COVES survey, we only used Net Promoter Score. We didn't have overall experience on there. As you saw from the Curator publication in 2018, COVES was primarily developed in 2015, 2016, so it hadn't actually gotten widespread museum notoriety. And we took a little bit of time adopting it, but as soon as we could, we did. We first actually introduced an overall experience rating question in that set of 0 to 10 ratings. So we had the OER question on the NPS scale, which was problematic, and we soon switched to the OER scale, truthfully and outright, as we've got years of data to support. But if we think about some particulars about either measurement, there's this first question of standardization. So how important is it to be standardized? And as you've all heard from Alex or Allison's training, standardization is really important. The whole reason COVES is successful is we've got the same questions asked in the same way over and over again, and we can report similarly, right? We can aggregate things, we can compare over time. I have seen versions of this asking about recommending to family or friends. I've seen versions of this where the 10 is the first choice and 0 is the last choice. It's a 5-star scale and anything in between. As you can see from this screenshot in the bottom right, even Windows asks a 1 to 5 scale question of Net Promoter Score. So when you think about standardization across industries, or you see industry benchmarks, like I'm going to show in a little bit, you always need to think about how people are asking this question. We always like to joke that, on a scale from rainbows to puppies, or, anything bad to anything good, it's like, how can we make these scales meaningful? Standardization is the first way. The second thing is sources of bias. I'm not going to dive too deep into these, but there are a lot of sources of bias. I'm going to show some slides from the COVES pilot study in just a second. You could think about bribery or collusion, or in fact, for our sake, data collectors who go up and say, hey, did you have a wonderful experience today? Would you be willing to take the COVES survey? Right? We don't want to give visitors a reason to respond in any way by thinking that there's any kind of collusion taking place. Sampling bias, which we're going to also talk about a little bit in the calculation of something like Net Promoter Score, but you can think about how either methodological choices or sampling choices could influence these metrics. And lastly, grade inflation, folks who always give top scores. As a side note, we had one Canadian institution, which is not enough to draw inferences from, but who had consistently different distributional patterns for the Net Promoter Score rating based on the location of the resident. So even at that Canadian institution, when they looked at their own data, people who lived in the US and people who lived in Canada or elsewhere, there were different patterns of responses. I think about this a lot when I get out of my Uber and they ask me to put in a 5-star rating, or better yet, the text message that I received after my most recent pest control visit, where they said, I strive to get a 10 out of 10 from all my customers, and anything under a 9 is a bad score, right? They're literally explaining the Net Promoter Score scale to me and kind of encouraging me to give a 10 because they know their reputation and their service performance is on the line. Not helpful for me, especially if you want a true rating. Going back to the COVES pilot study that I talked about just briefly, I believe there's a couple of institutions in this group who probably took part in that. We tested multiple methods of collecting data from visitors, an emailed survey, as I know many of you are also familiar with post-pandemic, an interviewed survey where we literally used the COVES protocol and asked visitors face-to-face what they thought, and then, of course, the on-site exit intercept, which you're all familiar with from our standard methodology. And here's the difference in ratings between a pure 10 on the Net Promoter Score scale and anything other than a 10. Statistically significantly different, right? Just the pure 10, the top score on this scale. Interestingly, if you look at just the Net Promoter Score categories, passives, promoters, and detractors, there's no statistically significant difference because of that combination of 9, 10, and how 0 to 6 and 7 and 8 shake out. So you might not have noticed it if you were just looking at the kind of net score distribution. But if we look at this graph and the different methods, you can see that green bar all the way on the right. There is a strong inclination for people who are asked face-to-face how likely are you to recommend the Museum of Science or COVES? People were more likely to give a perfect 10. The on-site survey breakdown, the distribution between 9 and 10, that shift is really important. And that's one of the reasons we use the methodology that we do to make sure that our data are as less biased as possible, as least biased, biased the least, whatever one eliminates bias. Minimum sample size requirements are also really important and primarily true for Net Promoter Score. And I'll just use one example to go quickly. If you've got anything under 100, say a sample of 50, and you survey the wrong person for any kind of sampling error reason, which is no fault of our data collectors and no fault of our own, it just happens. A switch from a promoter to a detractor would be a net score change of 4 points at a sample size of 50. At a sample size of 100, that changes to 2 points, and you can see it decreases as we get higher and higher. When we talk about data reliability or the accuracy of your COVES dashboard, we always want to see samples higher than 100. We prefer to see them closer to 400. For some of our smaller organizations, we recognize that that's almost a full year's worth of data, which complicates so many things. But as you interpret Net Promoter Score primarily, think about your sample size. OER is much less subjective based on sample size for just the same reason. If we took a sample size of 100 and you had that same sampling error, you'd be moving 1% in any given category, not 4 points because of the calculation versus just a distribution of response options. All right, so that was a lot of the technical information. I'm going to try and get through the next set of slides again fairly quickly because they're not totally revolutionary. Here are some examples. We wanted to come up with a lot of different data visualizations, but at the end of the day, I actually didn't have time, shocker. But here are some that we've used in the past. I'm a big fan of the Net Promoter Score data viz that kind of looks like a speedometer. It shows the full length of the scale rather than the distribution between 3 categories. If you are able to, if you get the chance in your publishing or presenting your own NPS data, I actually encourage you to show the full distribution of 0 to 10s. And I'll talk about that in another few slides because of this notion of a severe detractor, which is new to me, but people who are especially on the low end of that scale. All the way on the left, you'll see the range that COVES has used in certain reports, which I also like because it shows the aggregate or median Net Promoter Score, depending on the way those are calculated, but also the range across given institutions. You could think about this a range of seasons or years or anything that lead you to your overall Net Promoter Score, things like that. And the overall experience rating presentation or graph I like because it breaks out kind of the top 3 categories. As many of you who are familiar with your dashboard and your data know, we get proportionally very few poor and fair responses. That doesn't mean that they're not important for us to look at or think about or follow up on, but it means visually it's hard to see and they're less likely to be focused on other than changes at the top end of the scale. But again, thinking about the top end of the scale, it's important to think about that top level category, this one's superior, for you outstanding, and how we see fluctuations in the excellent and above categories. Here's another visualization that shows something like that far left range display that I showed. So it's 1 point among many. How does the composite 71.2 benchmark get set when it ranges from 54.6 to 80.1, and why does that matter? Here are some more crazy graphs, some which are not surprising, just numbers, some which are not surprising, just percentages over time. And then, of course, a whole range of, in this case, Net Promoter Score changes from year to year. So how we see consistency in the median or the aggregate, and how we see high variability in individual scores. And this could be done for either type of rating. The next set of slides shows industry benchmarks. This is, again, for Net Promoter Score. Unsurprisingly, not a whole lot of industry benchmarks for overall experience rating because you have to go to individual museums to get them or come to COVES. But we decided to show these industry benchmarks because, as you'll see here, they're low. The industry benchmark for retail, which is the highest among this group of industries, is below 30. And even though the upper range, or sorry, the range is from negative, 5 to 54 or something, if the high industry benchmark for them is 54, COVES as a set of museums consistently scores above 70 for our benchmark, our any point in time aggregate net promoter score. So across industries, museums have historically high net scores. And that's also really important, which gives credence to this idea that we need to actually study the top end of any scale, because that's where our visitors are following. That's where our customers are placing themselves. So again, you can see really, really low scores for things like car rentals and consumer payments. I've always joked about the TV internet service provider, and I'm glad to see it backed up here with a low NPS and a very tight range. They're all low. They're all terrible. Sorry, that's a little bit of, speaking of bias, that's mine. Here is another industry example, but this breaks down, you can see promoters, passives, detractors as 5s or 6, and severe detractors as 0 to 4. Now, I would argue that many of our organizations don't have enough data to support this idea of pulling out severe detractors as a standalone plottable thing for a graph or segment of visitors to analyze. But it is interesting to think about how the entire net score distributes and how you might use it for future analysis or thinking about what visitors are saying about why they place themselves in different categories. And as I mentioned, this is actually a quote from Pekarik in the 2018 article that we don't have OER benchmarks, but hopefully we will. In fact, I would argue COVES could serve as that benchmark, and we should do some publishing. All right, the last thing that I want to get through, and I know I'm running tight on time here, is the comparison between the two, because this is what generated this idea to have the Community of Practice webinar focus on this. The notion that you could have people in different categories, as it were, between the Net Promoter Score scale and the overall experience rating scale. If things were kind of uniformly distributed and people rated high, and rated low on the respective questions, you would see a distribution kind of like this, where detractors scored themselves poor on the OER scale, promoters were outstanding, and a little bit of spread in between as you go because the number of categories were different. But because of that, I would say it's not a bias, but because of what we know about our own visitors, I would expect to see something like this, where people cluster towards the top of both scales, right? We've got high net promoter scores, and we've got a high percentage of people saying they had an outstanding overall experience rating. And in fact, what we see from the 2022 year is exactly that. We've got way more people who are in the outstanding and promoter category than any other cell in this distribution. Now, what's surprising to me is that you have non-zero functional responses for kind of polar opposites, if you will, outstanding OER and detractor on the NPS scale, and vice versa, right? People who are poor on the OER scale and yet were promoters. They're very small, but it's interesting to think about. And so one of the reasons the COVES survey is designed the way it is because we ask this question, what is the most important reason for the rating you just gave? It's great that we have these aggregate data and we focus on the quantitative information and we can share a single number or a single percentage. But at the end of the day, if you want to make improvements, understanding why people are in different categories is really, really important. And I would argue, and in fact, our response to criticism that's come up in blog posts like Know Your Own Bone or other HBR articles is capitalizing on the qualitative information that visitors give us about why they rank themselves where they do. So if you have sufficient data, use the open-ended comments to evaluate the patterns. And if you can't, here is a cheat sheet, or at least what we've seen in the qualitative data so far. In general, people who have an outstanding experience but aren't promoters tend to come for something that's unique or temporary. And conversely, people who are promoters but just didn't have an outstanding or excellent experience just don't have that transcendental wow, time at the museum. Specifically, for folks who are detractors but rate themselves excellent or above, they tend to have a great single visit, but they lack recommendability. My friends and colleagues don't live close. No one I know likes science. I wish there were more stuff for people in my cohort, my age group, right? My group of people who only have kids at home or only are adults only, things like that. On the other side, people who are promoters but don't score in that excellent and above range tend to have a strong relationship with your museum, but just for one reason or another had a bad day. They had a bad time on that single instance in which we asked them to fill out this survey. So many exhibits were old or broken, there was construction noise today, it's too busy, etc., right? This thing I wanted to see was sold out. I like you, I'm promoting you, but today was not the best day. And that's also important because this can highlight the experiential factors that you can actually improve on. I also want to point out very quickly that this can highlight anomalies in the data that you may want to attend to. For example, in preparing for this presentation, I found a response from the Museum of Science collected in October of last year, where they said, "We are the best at surveys," as a joke response to their 0 on the Net Promoter Score scale, and then they give an outstanding on the OER scale, zip code of 90210, a few other indicators that they were just kind of having fun with us at our own expense. And so I point this out because if we've got joke data, we can scrub it. I don't like to do that. It's not my preferred method. You're going to have some wonky data all the time, and that's why we have sample sizes as high as we do for targets. But if you know something is erroneous, and I know a few people on this call have pointed that out, we can scrub it. Find the response ID, and we can discuss if it makes sense to remove it from your data set. Finally, a couple recommendations, and then we'll go to Q&A. Filter your data. Don't just look at the overall numbers. Even though I'll give you caveat after caveat about having sufficient data to make interpretations, you should take a look at promoters, passives, and detractors to see how they're functioning differently. You should take a look at poor and fair, good, excellent, outstanding to see how they're functioning differently. If you have the opportunity to pull the entire qualitative data within any given field, why did you give this rating for NPS? Why did you give this rating for OER? You can code it yourself just through sentiment analysis. Were they saying something extremely positive? Were they saying something that was kind of mixed, positive and negative? Were they saying something meh or neutral? Or were they actually highlighting something that was negative that you can remedy? And then again, identify aspects of the experience for you to tell others in your institution, because that's something that can be acted upon. That's a decision-making tool that you have at your disposal. And as a clear-cut example, and this is kind of in the sample bias, or that slide where we talked about don't just ask people who already promote you. Your members are going to promote you much more often than your non-members. So breaking those two groups out as a subgroup analysis can be really valuable in understanding, oh, it looks like I've got some, sorry about that. I thought I had no transitions in here. Net Promoter Score is different. Overall experience ratings differ between these two subgroups alone. So if you have the data to support it, break things out to see if you can find patterns. And lastly, we are going to collate the 1,000,002 resources that I used to prepare this presentation and kind of give you a 1 to 2 pager, which has either links to PDFs or links to websites, things to follow up on, possibly some article summaries. So you have more information at your disposal if and when you need to go back to a Net Promoter Score or overall experience rating, or so you can nerd out with me and we can talk about this for like 5 more hours. Just spend the rest of the workday just talking about these two things. Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing. I'm going to go to the chat. Alex or Allison, it would be great if there are things you can help, but this can also just be an opportunity for folks to jump in. No format. Unmute yourself and ask a question, put it in the chat, raise your hand, anything works.
There were 2 questions that came in while you were talking, Brian, also.
Okay.
And I think it was in the comparisons between the 2019 and 2021 distribution of superior/outstanding and excellent. Like the sum of the two is pretty similar, but then of course we saw more outstanding kind of post-pandemic.
Oh yeah. So Lauren, your question about was this isolated to matching institutions? I know some folks joined during that scale transition. That's a great question, and the answer is no, it wasn't matched. We tend to believe in the power of big numbers, right? The law of large numbers, but also that the COVES aggregate is very telling about our field as a whole. So it could absolutely be attributed to individual site differences. Although again, with the numbers as high as they were, like 20,000 responses, you'd have to have a lot different at a lot of different sites in order for that to be true. Most of the only matching that we tend to do for any visual representation or those explanations of like what's happening in COVES world is when we show like 2 years at a time. So that plotted FY18 to FY19 NPS change, those were same, right? If we're just talking about the aggregate, often we weight it, especially for our reports, but no. And then I see Gretchen's question as well, which says, how much do you think the general understanding of ordinal scales when laid out horizontally contributes to people understanding that outstanding is better than excellent? That's a great point. So to answer your question, a lot. I think if you put anything in a row and you say from like this end to this end, people are just going to assume it's linear in function. And this is a lot of source of commentary on both scales, that the interval between words is the same, or that the interval between numbers is the same, because, you know, conceptually, the difference between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 is the same. There's no argument there. The difference between poor and fair and good is subjective at best. Anytime the scale is laid out that way, you kind of clue visitors in. And that's exactly why I showed this on the standardization slide. If you ask people to how likely they are to recommend you, and you start with a 10 and end with a 0, even though that it's the same scale laid out horizontally, you're putting the 10 as the first number in theory that they read, because that's the way the English language works. So I would argue that both the scale and the use of words versus numbers, I mean, there are articles alone on this when it comes to the Net Promoter Score critique or in defense of overall experience rating and vice versa. So that matters a lot. All right, there's too much talking. There's got to be more now. So now group discussion or something. Someone throw some stuff out. Tom, what's up?
Hey, I was going to ask if you have a good reference point or benchmark, sort of like you do for-profit industries for nonprofits in general, or aggregated any old way. That's something it's not like I've spent hours searching for it, but I've Googled a number of times and found very little reference point, other than, of course, COVES has some reference point. But I'm curious if you have any definitive sources.
Nothing definitive. When it comes to a lot of this stuff, we kind of know what we know. And by that, I mean, we trust the COVES data because we developed the survey and we know the methodology. And so I would rely on COVES more than anything else. But this is a great point that maybe we should be producing, even if it was a 1 or 2 page report that was just the benchmarks that showed the overall and then the individual but anonymized institutional ratings. That's something for us to consider. And of course, kind of need soft approval from all of you, because we don't want to be identifying anyone in any way through that benchmarking. But no, I have nothing for nonprofits. And yes, I believe COVES could be that source for you.
So is it the same answer for OER?
The data that Ryan did share. Oops, Tom, you were asking for.
Sorry, I was just saying, I assume that it's the same answer for OER since it's lesser known and newer, but just double checking, is that also the case for OER for references?
It's more true for OER because we know fewer organizations of any kind that use it. And again, it was developed by within museums kind of for this purpose. And the notion that Pekaric was speaking to, that more people need to adopt it to establish a benchmark, COVES has done. I'm sure there are other projects that have done it too, but I'm not familiar with any benchmarking report that's used OER.
I was just going to say that the source that Ryan had put out there was from Qualtrics, and I found kind of a trove of literature that Qualtrics does in the deep in the back end of the dashboard somewhere when you're preparing for this, and it does. From everything I did look through, it looks to be mostly for-profit stuff, although it's mostly by type of industry. So I don't know, it could be like nonprofit interest. But I think there's an opportunity for more digging in this big, I don't know, repository of stuff that the Qualtrics XN Institute seems to publish about this. And most of it is Net Promoter Score centric. They don't know anything about.
Your audio is a little hard to hear, Alex, but the notion is exactly right. The benchmarks come from Qualtrics, and as a fun aside, their X4 Summit next month, they literally have an NPS. It's not Summit. It's unsurprisingly, because NPS was produced by this big consulting firm, Bain, and adopted by Harvard Business Review early on, there's a lot of money behind promoting it, right? There are books written about it. Not true with OER yet. So there's an entire group at the Qualtrics conference that is just focused on Net Promoter Scores, how to measure it, how to use it. Let me put it in your survey. And in fact, going back to my earlier comment about Rob Markey, or whatever his name is, coming to consult with us on our COVES survey, he wanted to make it the focal point of the instrument and delete a whole bunch of other important metrics for the museum field, just so we could focus more on Net Promoter Score. It's kind of hard having that conversation with someone who pretends they're very important or is very important, and just say like, thanks for your advice, but no. Net Promoter Score promoters, that's exactly right. I think there were some, okay, so Beth asked a question, a great question about comparing NPS ratings between locals and out-of-towners. Julie has already said our non-locals give us higher ratings. I can vouch for that. In our FY19 report, we did exactly that and showed the same finding. People are kind of, well, I don't want to give a rationale to the data, but my interpretation behind non-local high ratings is that they're like easily impressed, that they came to have fun. Again, it may be that expectation and experience thing, like you met my notion of having fun, whereas locals probably have a lot more opportunities at their disposal if they're making those decisions about what to do during leisure time. But again, that's not supported by data. What is supported is consistently higher ratings for non-locals.
Ryan, if I can follow up,
yeah.
My internet is unstable, it says. We kind of have a hunch that it's the opposite, and we have an interesting position because we can compare our two different museums. And I'm at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles, and we also have the La Brea Tar Pits. Our Natural History Museum is like 2/3 locals only group. The Tar Pits is people from all over the world coming because it's a kind of a unique, doesn't exist anywhere else. And we noticed that our Net Promoter Score there is lower, kind of a lot lower. And our hypothesis has always been that this is a tourist. I can't really recommend it to my family and friends because they don't live anywhere nearby because it's a really high tourist presence. Now the museum itself gets a little lower OER too, it's smaller. So that might explain some of it, but I know we are kind of skeptical of NPS because of that, because it's a very non-local audience versus folks who live nearby and can actually recommend that their friends come by. So
thanks for chiming in, Beth. That's really interesting. And Alex puts a great point in the chat as well, which is that proximity to your museum and membership are highly correlated in that people who live far away are unlikely to be members, and we know members and non-members differ. So that's probably better for a non-member analysis only in thinking about locals. Who is local to the museum that's not a member, what's their experience like, and similarly for non-locals. And I will say the obvious caveat as well, which is the COVES instrument is in English and Spanish. We do not have it in other languages. So if you're a highly international tourist destination, you are, systematically missing visitors who do not speak English and Spanish. And we know that's a flaw in our system. And again, we talk about translation a lot, and we've worked with many of you on Spanish translations and beyond, or who are thinking about it. But we need to acknowledge that when we talk about generalizing to our audiences. There's a lot of good stuff going on in the chat, so much so that I'm worried, with 5 minutes left, we're clearly not going to get to small group breakouts and then some kind of summary discussion. So, put more stuff in the chat. Think about what else we could discuss moving forward when it comes to this, or better yet, plant seeds of ideas for analyses that we can do. Gretchen is noting that people who do not give demographics have lower NPS and OER ratings. So, that's fascinating. I have no idea why that might be.
Don't miss Courtney's comment also, Ryan. There's some deep nerd stuff in there about confidence interval and
yeah. So
percentiles.
we can produce a scatter plot of the scores for both scales, but so Courtney, if you're still here, which I hope you are, you can follow up. Do you mean an institutional scatter plot, like basically showing the ranges for institutions, because at an individual level, you could do that, right? The scatter plot of your own data, just plotting the OER and the NPS 0 to 10 rating to see how those align. You'd probably, in fact, you'd see something very similar to what I showed, because that was all of the data, but you'd see a massive dots, obviously. Confidence intervals are really interesting, but worth talking about, not on today's call, because that's just like the statistics of the COVES survey, but the margin of error calculation for the Net Promoter Score itself is super wonky because it's net score and it omits the passives, right? So it does hinge almost entirely on the sample size, but it is a different calculation than I've ever used for any other single point estimate. Whereas doing something for, you know, a percentage, you basically plot the percentage and then kind of say this is within a range, right? A margin of error. I will share that margin of error reference guide that I found in the resources that we mentioned. So some of the stats behind NPS, but it's much more straightforward for overall experience rating. This is good. Yes, Kate Metter, great point about like when people read the Net Promoter Score question, are they just like, oh, did I have a good time? Right? And then you get to the overall experience, you're like, wait, why are they asking me that again? That's so weird. How many people read the words in the question itself and think about it exclusively as a likelihood to recommend, excuse me. It's fair. And then, yeah. And then Gretchen, it's been on my list to try and figure out what's going on. Are people who have less than good time just less invested in filling out demographics? Or are we not providing as good an experience for people who might be skeptical of providing demographics? Ooh, I like it. Do the analysis and let us all know what you learned. Okay, well, I see lots of people acknowledging that we are very close to the end of the hour. NPS score varies greatly by region. Makes me think that New Yorkers may be a little grumpy compared to other areas. I love that notion because I would agree. We all have different ideas about who's local to our museum. At the Museum of Science in Boston, we like to say that they're more rough on our exhibit components than anything else. And if they can't break it, it's good everywhere. But, you know, I think perceptions also matter. And I think region influences perceptions. Maybe that's just a stereotype. Midwesterners are very nice.
Worth doing the analysis on.
Yeah. I'd love to see the organizational anonymized spread and see it split by region size. All these good ideas. I love it. We've got lots of work left to do. But I'm gonna cut it off here. If you have any comments or questions, in fact, I had a whole list of things for us to discuss. So I'll just let you know now. If you have additional considerations for either metric, most of which has come up in the chat, but if you have anything else, let us know, coves@mos.org. If you have additional resources that I didn't cite or that you just have and you think we should know about, let us know, because again, we're going to try and share out all the resources for everyone so you can reference later. And then of course, we're always looking for how people use NPS and OER, because that could influence how we think about and report out on either metric, or give you resources for additional support in using either one. So thank you all. It was great seeing you. Questions were awesome. Comments were wonderful. We look forward to seeing you next month on the call when we're going to start talking about 2022 reporting that you've done and ideas for kind of higher level stuff that aren't just about NPS and OER. So have a wonderful Tuesday. Happy Valentine's Day. See you soon, everyone. Bye.